Can you just talk a little bit, Mike, about the power this man wielded, the purse strings he controlled, and just who Ed Burke was while he was in council?
Yeah, well, he succeeded his father Joe. I think the family had that seat, his dad and he, for something going on 7 decades. Joe Burke was a power in the council, and he. I think there was a brief interlude, and then Ed, his son, took over back in the 1960s, and had commuted to DePaul Law School, I believe, with Richard M. Daley. Joe Burke had been an ally of Mayor Richard J. Daley. There were lots of family connections there. The 14th Ward that we referred to, that you mentioned, while that number stayed the same, over these 5.5 decades that Ed Burke was in the council, the actual location of the 14th Ward moved a lot because of racial and ethnic changes. And of course, in the final few years, the ward became majority Hispanic, Scott.
Talk a little bit about this, Mike, if you will, this sort of quid pro quo. Sure, you want a Burger King in my ward. Well, I've got a law firm, and you want a Benny's. Well, you've got to scratch my back. Can you touch on that?
Yeah, and the third alleged scheme, we have to see just what charges the jury convicted him on here in terms of the racketeering, bribery, and extortion allegations that the feds brought. But we do have at least 8. Do you have an update on that count? At least
I still only have the 6,
counts?
but we're working on that.
6.
We're up to 13 now. Is it guilty?
We know he's guilty on 6 counts.
Okay.
But yeah, these schemes were, the claim that the feds and the FBI made, and what the tapes indicated that Danny Solis recorded, and then eavesdropped on recorded conversations, was that Burke wanted the owner of this Burger King, wanted the guy, the developer at the old post office and elsewhere, and the Binny's Beverage Depot on the northwest side, wanted him to do business with his law firm. Say, hey, I'll cut your property taxes. It looks like we have an account there. The graphic shows the charges against Burke. They're an allegation of racketeering.
These are just the charges:
bribery, attempted extortion, conspiracy to commit extortion, and then using interstate commerce for unlawful activity. What that translates into in simple English is that they claim that he leaned on and threatened business owners that they wouldn't get certain things unless they accommodated him. There was also an allegation that that Ed Burke threatened to block a fee increase for one of the downtown museums unless a former city council colleague got his granddaughter an internship. In the end, I believe she actually turned down the internship, which was one of the things that was cited by Burke's defense lawyers to say, he wasn't trying to stick him up. This was just what politicians do. This is what community leaders do on behalf of friends and supporters.
I'd be remiss. We haven't even mentioned his wife, who stepped down from the Illinois Supreme Court. He's been found guilty on 13 of 14 counts. Mike, what does this do for her?
Well, she has stepped down, Ann Burke, from the state Supreme Court, where she had been a justice for many years, and had played a key role on the court, which actually has an important function in overseeing lower courts. She generally was regarded as an active and involved and reasonably fair jurist. But this casts a shadow over her career, as it does over all of those connected to Ed Burke. you're mentioning that, Scott, underscores the role that Ed Burke played for decades and decades and decades in slate making for the Cook County Circuit Court. Of course, judgeships in Illinois are elected, not appointed for the most part, and Burke was chair of the Democratic Party's Judicial Slate Making Committee. He was the guy who he could make a judge, he could break a judge, and that power is going to be felt still for decades to come. Many of the people that Ed Burke put on the bench remain there, and will for decades to come.
You use the word power. We talk about Danny Solis. We talk about that wire. I think we have to talk a little bit about Mike Madigan. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Mike, he recently asked to have his trial pushed back. Being found guilty, Ed Burke, on 13 of 14 counts, I would imagine the Madigan camp very nervous today.
Well, yeah, and Scott, I'm put in mind of the ComEd 4 trial. I was down there at the Dirksen court a few months ago when the verdict came in on the ComEd 4, and a young woman who had served on that jury came down from the courtroom, walked right up to our microphones, and began to talk about, among other things, how she and the rest of the jury wished that Mike Madigan had been part of that case, so that they could have voted to convict him too, as well as all 4 of the so-called ComEd 4 executives of that powerful electric utility. It's got to be one more chilling piece of evidence for what I said a few minutes ago. I think when a politician a Chicago politician goes into the dock here, despite what the U.S. Constitution says, the jury's ready to convict before they hear a scintilla of evidence. Generally, those public figures, those political figures here at least, are regarded as guilty until proven innocent.
Where does this leave? We talk about end of an era. When Burke stepped down this past spring. Where does this leave the power brokers in city council when we look at the makeup today?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure how much of a political impact this has now, because this council is so different from the city council and councils plural that Ed Burke dominated for so long. But 5 years ago, when the FBI put that butcher paper up on the office of the City Council Finance Committee, and the place was closed up for business while they went through all of his records and searched things, there was one immediate political impact, Scott, and that was to boost Lori Lightfoot. In many ways, Lori Lightfoot owes her one term as sort of an accidental mayor to this investigation of Ed Burke, because as you'll remember, she was in the runoff against Tony Preckwinkle.
Right.
And then even before the runoff, and when in the larger field, in the first round of that election back in 2019, of that mayoral election, there was another strong candidate, Susana Mendoza. Well, both Mendoza and Tony Preckwinkle had received political funds and had held fundraisers with Ann and Ed Burke, and in some cases, I believe, at Burke's home. And they were mortally damaged by the Burke investigation. Ironically, even though he didn't get along at all with Lori Lightfoot, and she would never have been his choice for mayor, this investigation, this whole sequence of events, is really what led to her going from about 2 points in the polls up to about 16 or 17, which was enough to get into the runoff, and then to win election against Preckwinkle.
Very interesting. Danny Solis, so he brought down one whale, potentially bringing down another one if Madigan goes down. if has he changed at all the way I think? I don't know how I want to word this. Wearing a wire, becoming a mole for the FBI against a colleague, that's not something we've seen, or have we? Help me with my history here. What does that do for, I guess, I don't want to use the word morale, but for the landscaping council with regard to trust, for lack of a better word?
Well, trust in what sense?
And I guess, who would have imagined?
Do they trust one another?
Yeah. Who would imagine if you're Ed Burke that you're on the phone with, your trusted colleague for how many years, and he's wearing a wire for the feds?
Well, let me give you an insight. It wasn't a member of the city council, but it was a state rep who told me a few months ago, Scott, that he had he was in a meeting, and somebody in this meeting made what he considered an outlandish suggestion, and he told me, Mike, I started looking around. Where's the FBI camera? Where's the microphone?
That's an answer. That's an answer.
I think there's a lot of that.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And again, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about, this is Chicago, and we talk about the reputation, and we're looking at this man and his $1,000 suits, and always so calm, and absolutely I'm innocent, and I'm going to be proven innocent in a court of law. I remember when Joni was at his house when the charges, Joni Lum, the morning of the day after the charges came out, and he was going to prove his innocence in court, and here we are. But when we talk about legacy, Mike, with regard to the stain on the city, with regard to these 13 guilty counts, and I'll just read a couple of them here. I'm holding them in my hands. Racketeering, extortion, unlawfully accepting property of another, racketeering, bribery, interference with commerce by threat or violence. What kind of a mark does that leave on the city in your mind?
We've had so many of these, Scott. I think that it has changed the face of the council. I think I do agree with J.B. Pritzker. He and I had a conversation a few months ago. I think there's less of this now. I think there are fewer people going into the city council or the Illinois General Assembly just to make money than there used to be. I think ideology is a larger factor than it used to be. We can make ourselves dizzy arguing about whether, how much progress that represents, and whether that poses other problems, perhaps for public policy and public life. But the kind of in it just to make a buck, I think there are fewer of those people in public life today than there used to be, and I think this underscores for any members of the council, members of the General Assembly, members of the county board, suburban political figures. If you got larceny in your heart, you want to think twice, and you want to be up there looking out for those FBI video cameras.
Those who forget history, Mike, are doomed to repeat it. Those who know Ed Burke know that he has a very keen sense of history. Those of us who know you know that you, of course, share that affinity for our past. What do we need to remember about this day? What does City Council need to remember? What do Chicagoans need to remember about this day?
I think there are still a number of specific reform measures that the General Assembly should adopt, not least, Scott, what the City Council's already done. The City Council, in some senses, the Chicago City Council is ahead of the Illinois General Assembly in some reforms. And I'll start with one that I think is just ridiculous, that it hasn't been done at the state level. The City Council now has forbidden aldermen to function as lobbyists. Now that almost sounds like a joke, doesn't it?
Yep.
That you could be an elected official and then lobby other local governments or state governments. It's time for the General Assembly to do that as well, and to have state reps, state senators, state officials not be able to get paid as contract lobbyists. It's just a ridiculous, obvious conflict of interest, and I think it should be outlawed. And one of the, as much as Mayor Lightfoot was in there for just one term, we haven't looked perhaps closely enough at this aldermanic prerogative.
Yeah, that was my next question. You read my mind.
Yeah, that the alderman, so Ed Burke in the 14th Ward, he in effect had a veto over a curb cut. Remember, that's what that owner of the Burger King there at 41st and Pulaski won. He wanted authorization for a curb cut for additional access to the parking lot, among other things. And Burke was able to mess with that. Now he was foiled in the end on that because the owner there didn't go along. But that has to be looked at, and there I think there's a way to protect the legitimate oversight of an elected official in his or her neighborhood, while protecting against abuses.